So if you're following along in your own Bible, we are picking up right at the beginning of Acts chapter 20. And this is actually a really interesting story. I remember vividly the first time I was ever told this story because it really stands out to you, and probably it was presented to me in a very creative way as well. But let's start right in chapter 20, verse 1. It says, "When the uproar ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia." Now, just as a really quick reference, what's the uproar? The uproar was the near riot that just happened in Ephesus. If you remember, Paul is in Ephesus. He's getting prepared. He wants to go to Macedonia. But he stayed in Ephesus, and he was preaching and teaching. People got upset. A real ruckus broke out. Things were getting bad. And then eventually they got up there and said, look, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. If you have charges to bring against Paul and other believers like him, then bring them in the court. But if not, then, there's a right way to do this, and if you do it the wrong way, if you're going to go out for your mob justice, the Romans are going to come in and settle this real quick. And no one wanted that, so the uproar subsided. And the other thing I wanted to mention really quickly, only because I know when I was a young Christian, when I first came to the faith, I had this real trouble in distinguishing, because in my mind, the disciples were the 12. And when it says Paul sent for the disciples, he's not talking about the 12. He's talking about disciples, like believers, followers, people who have pledged themselves to following and learning about the faith, the way, as it's been referenced many times here in the book of Acts. He's sent for them because he wants to encourage them. He wants to encourage the saints that are here in Ephesus, because he is planning to make his way out to Macedonia. If you remember, he's on one side of the Aegean. He's on the east side of the Aegean. He's going to be crossing the Aegean to the other side, what is now modern-day Greece. It says he traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece. Now, if you remember, Rebecca, could you put up the map? If you remember, Greece isn't what we think of as Greece today. I didn't put the map on there, did I? My bad. Okay, if you remember, Greece isn't what we think of as Greece today. Greece is basically just the Greek islands kind of off on the tip. And so really the only Greek place that we know for sure that Paul was visiting, at least on the regular, was Corinth. And so when we hear here he arrived in Greece, we can assume he's arriving back in Corinth. Whether he crossed the sea or whether he went the land route, it's not super clear which way he went, but it seems like the most likely route he took was across the sea to Corinth. And he arrives in Greece, where he stays for 3 months. Why? Because some Jews plotted against him just as he was about to sail for Syria, and he decided to go back through Macedonia. And if you remember, by looking at the map, that's because if you're in Greece and you want to take a land route, you have to go north all the way up through Macedonia and up and back around. And what's in Syria? Antioch. Antioch is Paul's home church, his home base. Seems like he wants to get reconnected and go back there. Now, pay attention. There's a major shift just happens here. And I almost missed it the first time I went through. It says he was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy also, and Titus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. If you remember all the places of those, like the names of the places, those were all over in modern-day Turkey, where Paul had spent so much time preaching before. And here's the shift. Verse 5. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. We're going to see a big shift here. Remember, this is written by Luke. The letter was literally introduced, right? The letter of Luke is introduced, dear Theophilus, blah, blah, blah. We have here, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about Jesus and began to teach, right? He's writing a biography. He's collecting the stories. He's been talking to witnesses. But there's a big shift here. This isn't something that he heard about. This isn't a story that he gathered. This is something that Luke saw. Right? We're about to get into one of the rare situations where Luke's not just writing about something that he heard about, but something that he saw. And the reason I want to stress this, again, is because us today, to write the word us, could be a typo. To be in the ancient world where whatever writing material you're using, whether it's animal skin, papyrus, some sort of clay tablet, it doesn't matter what it is incredibly expensive and incredibly valuable. So which means you are incredibly specific about the words that you choose, and you don't make that kind of mistake, because if you do, you can't afford to fix it. It costs too much money. And it says, but you're also going to notice he's going to keep using this language over and over again. Verse 6, but we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, and 5 days later we joined the others at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Now, if you're not familiar, we're actually coming up to the festival of unleavened bread. The festival of unleavened bread is the week before Easter, right? For them, it's the week before Passover, but for us, it's the week before Easter. And the whole idea was, it was about getting ready. First off, it got started because, remember, they were in a rush to get out of Egypt, right? We got to leave Egypt in a hurry. We don't have time to let the bread rise. And if you've ever come to the Seder here, you know we talk about that. We talk about the story. We talk about the flight from Egypt, and why there's this whole emphasis on unleavened bread that has not risen, bread that does not have yeast. Right? And so here it is. It's like this cleansing time. We also read other stories about this festival, like when Jesus went into the temple and cleansed the temple. Right? This is that same time period, that same festival that was being done. And the reason I want to bring that up is because I think there's an incredible thing happens given the time frame of what we're looking at. It says, on the first day of the week we came together, he's there, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people. And because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking till midnight. And there were many lamps on in the upstairs room where we were meeting. And seated in the window was a young man named Eutychus, right? Right. So, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul was talking on and on. You don't hear that phrase very often in the Bible. And I hope no one here has ever thought that of me. Because here's the thing. This is the first thing I thought of. I've seen people do if I go 15 minutes over service, okay? He talked until midnight. And so you can understand he's a young man. He was probably out working all day. Then he's really excited, right? Because he's obviously a believer. If he's there when Paul shows up, he's obviously a believer. So he shows up. He wants to hear the words of Paul. And it's not that Paul isn't intriguing, because obviously there's a room full of people and they want to hear what Paul has to say. So obviously what he has to say is important. But it's understandable when you're in a nice hot room like that, because let's remember, it's all lit with torches because it's dark outside and it's all lit up and it's getting hot and the room is packed and there's body heat. And so he's sitting there at the window and he's like, oh, I am dying. But he sunk into a deep sleep as Paul was talking on and on, all while he was seated in the window. It says when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the 3rd story and was picked up dead. This is why I've been making a big deal about the fact that this is Luke's experience. This is something that Luke saw. Right? If you don't know, a lot of the speculation about Luke, a lot of the scholarly consent is that Luke was some form of physician. Right? He had some sort of, at least that kind of background in some sort of medicine. Right, so he knows what he knows and he sees what he sees, and right, it's often caused like some controversy over why didn't he include some things and not others in his gospel. But one of the things that we can definitely say is that he saw this. He saw this and he decided to write it down. He saw this and decided this was so important, I need to write this down. This guy fell from the 3rd story and he was dead. It says Paul went down, threw himself on the young man and put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, he said. He is alive. Then he went upstairs again, broke bread, and ate. And after talking until daylight, so not even midnight, he just kept going for the rest of the night, he left. It says the people then took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. I remember I put this in my notes as I was going through. I was like, how strange is that? A dude literally fell out of a window and died, and they just carry on the rest of the night almost as if nothing happened. Right? Can you imagine the stuff that they must have seen, right? Because we just read, it just says signs and wonders or signs and miracles were happening in their midst and things were going on and they were seeing the move of the Spirit and they were seeing all this stuff happen, that when they see a guy literally be brought back from the dead, they just go, yeah, of course God did that. Of course. Hey, Paul, can you finish telling us what you were just saying? Like, we want to hear until the break of dawn what is going But one of the things that really caught me up on this, one of the reasons why I got so fixated on the language, on the terms that are being used, the fact that it was Luke that was there, is because this is a story that I can guarantee you, if Luke wrote it down and put it in the book of Acts, you can guarantee this was a story that he was going around telling people. Right? I mean, how many things do we go around and say to people that we never bothered to write down? Right? That we don't want to record for the rest of the time. We don't necessarily, but we have experiences. We have things that go on in our lives. We have our own stories that we live and breathe and see. We have experiences with God. I've shared many of mine here, from right here. Things that God has done in my life. We share it during our prayer time when we talk about the things that God has been doing and the move of the Spirit that's been going on in our lives and the things that God is doing in the world. And it's so incredible. It's so incredible to see and hear. I said, I wrote down this. I said, this is written in the style of, you're never going to believe this, but, right? Can you imagine if this was you having to tell your friends what was going on? You go, yeah, you remember that guy Paul? Yeah, Paul was here. Yeah, we got to go and I got to hang out with him and we got to listen to him all this time. Oh yeah, and you remember what was his name? Huey? We'll call him Huey because I don't want to try and say that name over Ute. Ute, he fell right out of the window. But Paul just said he's alive and he got back up. People are like, he was fine. He just got knocked out. He just said, no, he was dead. He was dead. They found him on the ground. They went, oh my goodness, this guy, he's dead. No one would believe that. And yet this whole crowd saw it. This whole crowd witnessed it. This is written in I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. If any of you are involved in listening to debates or in arguments yourself with people arguing for the faith or defending the faith, you'll know that one of the main things that often gets brought up is they'll say things like, well, your experience, while interesting, is not evidence for your position. Well, that may be true. But there's a lot of reason, there's good reason why I believe what I believe, and a lot of it has to do with our experience. Each and every one of us has a story that we can share and said, I only believe this, I only dedicate my life in this way, I only live my life a certain way because I had this certain experience in my life. Right? And it's not just limited to faith. Right? It's not just limited to putting your faith in Jesus Christ. It could be as simple as, look, there's a reason I don't play around with electricity. There's a reason why I call Jordan. Because I've been electrocuted too many times, and that has implanted that very real experience has planted a very real seed of doubt in my heart when I have to play around with electricity. And people can say, oh, well, no, there's safe ways to do it, and there's all this stuff, and you can do it this way, you can do it this way, and I'm go, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you think that. My experience has taught me I'm going to die, so I'm not going to do it. But we also have stories about our faith, ways that God have transformed us. I've heard so many, standing right up here as we hear about answered prayer, cancer that has been miraculously removed. I mean, I've been constantly having baby Easton on my mind all the time. The miraculous things that are happening in that child's life. And the doctors go, oh, it's just fixing itself. Oh, this is just happening. Yeah, I'm sure it's just happening. Many of us have had very real experiences. We've had encounters with God. Some of us have had miraculous healing. Some of us have had a word so clear it was, or dreams or visions. We've had encounters with God that were so real, and I know what I saw. What's amazing about this is that these stories are incredibly powerful. They're so powerful, in fact, that even skeptics, when they come up against Jesus Christ, when they come up against God, they say, well, I'm just not convinced. I don't believe in I don't believe that there's enough here because I haven't experienced that myself. That's not in my experience. It's not in my realm. I haven't seen that. Well, I'm sorry, but your experience doesn't necessarily dictate what reality is, does it? But our experience is powerful. It does change the way that we look at the world. It changes the way that we feel about things. Someone brought this up to me recently, and it really stuck with me because as you know, I've been really trying to go back to first principles when I talk about and argue about the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, I don't know any serious academics who say Jesus wasn't a real person, right? Anyone who's serious says he was real. We know he was real. We know he was crucified, okay? The records show that. The dispute becomes, did he rise again? That's it. Is the grave empty? Because guess what? If the grave is empty, then that means everything. That means everything that the Bible says we need to be really taking seriously. Why? Because Jesus said he took it seriously. So that means we got to go, wait a minute, those things that Jesus said, those things that he did, the life that he lived, the sacrifice that he made for us, that was real. And people will say, well, how can I rely on that? How can I count on that? How can I know it's true? I want to ask, how did Abraham Lincoln die? How do you know? Were you there, Carol? You weren't there. You don't know. You weren't in that theater. If he was in a theater at all, he never went to a theater ever. I don't have any evidence that he went to a theater ever. Right? Everything that we take, absolutely everything we believe about history is based on a collaboration of evidence that we have, and we just have to make do with, look, this is what it is. The fact that a crowd of witnesses saw Jesus alive after he was crucified, after his side was tore open with that spear, after blood and water poured out. The fact that he was wrapped up, placed in a tomb, and then a small crowd witnessed him going up into heaven. I'm sorry, but I'm going to go with the witnesses on this one. To me, it sounds more ridiculous not to believe. There's so much more evidence that Jesus is resurrected than Abraham Lincoln got shot in the head. There's way more evidence that Jesus is resurrected than Julius Caesar even existed. We don't even know if he was real. And yet, so many people would believe it without a shadow of a doubt. The best thing is, right? How do we use this? How do we understand what good is our stories? What good is this evidence? Well, here's the thing. Each and every one of us has had a loved one that's gone through something. Maybe something traumatic, something tragic. Maybe they witnessed a crime or they witnessed some sort of tragic event. All of us have had these kinds of experiences, and all of us have had loved ones with these kinds of experiences. And guess what? We become more informed when we allow ourselves to hear their stories and allow their stories to impact our lives. The fact of the matter is, and this still blows my mind. So, Jordan, I want to tell you, okay, there's this event in 2001 on 9/11. You probably have heard of it, but you weren't alive to know what happened. Right? That was such a moment in history that those of us who were old enough to remember have it forever seared, right? Where we were when we got the news. We remember the pictures that we saw on the television. We remember watching all these things. Why? Because those things, those stories, that experience that we had was so real and so powerful, we cannot forget. And many of us have that same level of experience, that same level of a powerful encounter with God when God came in and absolutely transformed a part of our life. As I've said before, I've shared many of the things that God has done for me, like from my miraculous healing. There's been many other things. There's some that I'll probably keep private. I'll only ever tell my wife some of the things because I feel like those were things that God told me and me alone. But at the end of the day, our stories are powerful, and we need to begin telling our stories. How did you get saved? It very likely started with someone telling you the story, telling you their story. You starting to think about it, mulling it over in your mind and going, is there anything to this? Because guess what? At the end of the day, we can say it's not evidence, but we know that it impacts us. We know that stories are powerful, and we know that these firsthand accounts will transform our lives forever. And your story, even if it doesn't result in a young man coming back to life, your story is just as powerful to somebody else. Your story could be the difference between someone accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior or not. Again, you'll hear people say that your story isn't evidence, but I'm sure that if it was their story, they would tell the world too. So this takes me back to what I said last week. We need to be strong and courageous, right? Hear that call from the book of Joshua. Be strong and courageous as we go forward, and be bold and tell someone about our story. Let us not be ashamed of the gospel, but instead be bold as we proclaim with loud voices, God is good, and this is what he has done for me. Right? The book of Romans lays it out. How will they get saved if no one tells them? How will anyone tell them if no one goes? And how will anyone go if you haven't been sent? So I'm sending you. Go out. Tell them. But they can't hear you unless you share your story. Unless you share your encounter. Let's make events like this, where Paul lays his arms around this man and says he is alive. And they end up just going back along with the rest of their night. Wouldn't it be amazing if God were that active in our world again? That our world just reached out and cried, Abba, Father, that we loved God that much, that those events no longer surprised us once more, but instead became more common. Let us share what Jesus has done